This lecture, this presentation, we are going to begin a lecture series on Congress, which you were introduced to in our previous assignment. And again, already we've learned some about it in our look at the Constitution, especially Article 1. So first, what is Congress? You already know some of this. Congress is the legislative branch of our federal government. You know its key powers, especially those things in Article 1, Section 8. You know that it is bicameral, meaning it has two chambers or houses, the House and the Senate. You also know its basic structures and components. You, of course, have those the reference packet to help you remember those. You also have learned some of the key positions already, also through or look at the Constitution, but more specifically in that reference packet and your work from yesterday. Here we're talking about things like the Speaker of the House, Majority Leader in the Senate, and you also have seen in your earlier work in that reference packet the legislative process. And even before our work from yesterday, you learned about checks and balances as we looked at the Madisonian design for checks and balances. We will be learning more about these things as we go, but you have some sense already going into this of the things you need to know. The primary purpose here is going to be to fill in some of the gaps in the material we've already seen, but also to expand on what you've already learned to more fully understand Congress, how it works, and what it does. In that direction, we're going to learn about more differences between the chambers and the leadership in both chambers. We'll learn about things called caucuses. We'll learn about the Speaker's role and how it has changed over time. We will learn more specifics about committees in both chambers and how they work and what they do. And we'll also learn about the importance of staffers and staff agencies to the work of Congress. Let's start with the chamber differences. The House, we already know, right? The House is the larger of the two chambers, 435 members, 2-year terms. They represent a district within a state rather than the whole state. And as I've encouraged you to think before, as we consider the two houses, I think of them as if they were nightclubs, and the House is the less exclusive nightclub. So adding to things like the less exclusive membership with 435, the shorter terms at 2 years, representing fewer people. As you've already seen, also, you don't have to be as old. You have to be 25 to be in the House of Representatives. There are some other differences before we get to the Senate itself. But already here we're going to be comparing the two. So the House has more centralized control of its chamber. And very much hand in hand with that, it is more hierarchical. So there is more stratification in terms of who has power and control within the House, and the higher we get, the more of the power is centered on those people. To some extent that this is a formal hierarchy, with the Speaker of the House being constitutionally the leader of that chamber, for example, but it is also a seniority-based system where more senior people have more important positions in, for example, committees, which we'll see later. But for now, just understand that it is more centralized, more hierarchical, and part of what makes all of that function is that there is also much more discipline. I don't mean in terms of punishment and such, but it has much more clear-cut and restrictive rules for proceedings in the House. And in terms of party discipline, there is more of it. And so votes along party lines, meaning votes for a bill are almost entirely one party voting yay and the other party voting nay. You don't have a lot of Republicans crossing over to vote with Democrats or vice versa on floor votes. The Senate, and you can think of that as the more exclusive nightclub, 100 members, 2 for each state. Each member represents an entire state. They get to stay there for 6 years. You have to be 30 to be in the Senate. It's a more exclusive nightclub. Part of what you might also think of with that exclusivity is the members all have more autonomy. And what they do is less structured, less constrained than it is in the other houses. So there is less centralized control. There is far less hierarchy, especially in terms of seniority. But also, as we're going to see as we get into this, this also plays into discipline. There are fewer rules on things, for example, most importantly, like time limits for floor debate. And as I already kind of got ahead of myself there, seniority is less important. We always talk about senior and junior senators from a state, but in terms of the influence, there's far less difference between junior and senior senators. In this comparison, we've already talked a bit about leadership like the Speaker of the House. We need to compare the leadership patterns in the 2 chambers. Much of this I'm not going to talk about in detail. For this, you need to think about your reference packet, which has the Speaker, the President of the Senate, all of these things laid out really in the first 2 pages of that reference packet. One of the things that is the same about leaders in both chambers is that they get to set the agendas for their own chambers. The House sets what it's going to consider, the Senate sets what it's going to consider. They both proceed with bills and other activities the way they choose to do so. In the House, the Speaker is special. The Speaker is a constitutionally mandated position for the House of Representatives. They are, by constitutional definition, the leader of that chamber. They are chosen by a majority in the House. In practice, the way this works is they are a member of the majority party, and they rely on the membership of their party to vote them to be Speaker of the House. It's very much a partisan position in addition to being a constitutional position. In the Senate, the Vice President is the constitutional leader. So when I mentioned the President of the Senate, well, the Vice President is the President of the Senate. Now, despite being called the President of the Senate, for the most part, the Vice President has essentially little actual role, although we do know importantly, sometimes very importantly, the Vice President is able to cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate. When the Senate is split 50-50, the Vice President can step in and cast the deciding vote. The other position is the President pro tempore, and this can be different people. This person does not have any agenda setting role. It's not a position with real authority. It is just somebody who acts as the presiding officer in the Senate for that time. So they can manage the basic routines of proceedings, but this is, again, not a powerful position. The powerful positions are the leaders that the party chooses. So you have the majority leader of the Senate. That is the most important of those positions. The other positions you can see in your reference packet. But the majority leader is the person who ends up getting to set the agenda for the chamber. And agenda setting, I know it doesn't necessarily sound all that important, but if you are the person who gets to decide what this chamber is going to consider, then you are shaping what it is going to do and decidedly what it is not going to consider. So the majority party leader can be very influential in shutting out things that the minority party would like to accomplish. Right? The bills they would like to bring up, the things they would like to have voted on. And then, of course, on the other side, there is the minority leader, who is also elected, again, by, as you might have guessed, the party that does not have a majority in the Senate. Now, we've talked about party a lot in this. Why is party so central to what we're talking about? Well, the reason for that is caucuses. Caucuses are informal structures, meaning they're not written into the Constitution that they have to be a part of how the House and the Senate work. But they are informal groupings of representatives and senators. And there's tons of them. I mean, for all kinds of stuff. There was even one for a while, I think it's now defunct, about the contaminated drywall caucus, when there was a scandal about some drywall imported into the United States from China that turned out to have some toxic chemicals, especially when it got wet, something along those lines. But there's tons of these things, about 500. A caucus can be any group of people in representatives or senators based on a shared interest, like interest in contaminated drywall, or characteristic. So one of the things we have is the Congressional Black Caucus. The characteristic, these are African American members of Congress. But as we talk about these, the most important are the party caucuses. There's a Democratic caucus and a Republican caucus. You really cannot have any impact in Congress or really participate in its workings unless you belong to one of these caucuses, which is why, although the Senate does have independents and has had independents, those independents always have to caucus with one party or another. Currently, independents caucus with the Democrats. Well, take a step back here. To give you some examples of the niche kind of caucuses, we have the Congressional Voting Caucus, but you also have very influential caucuses. The House Freedom Caucus is an important caucus within the Republican caucus. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, an important caucus within the Democrats' larger caucus. We're going to come back now to talk about leaders with a special focus on the role of the Speaker of the House. And as will happen more times, I'm sure, as we go, for a lot of things, remember, use your references packet. Specifically, for example, that first page, I believe it's the first page in that packet, whichever one has the organization of the House of Representatives so that you can understand the Speaker's role. What we're going to be focused on here is not the Speaker's role in general, or necessarily as it is at this particular moment. We're going to be looking at the change of the Speaker's role over time. And the thing to understand here is that once Speaker's role was autocratic. Now, I put that in quotation marks, scare quotes, because we've learned about autocracies as a regime type. This is not autocratic in that same sense, but I use that word on purpose because others have, and it does really capture the power that speakers once had. They could be, and in this case it was men, a one-man show in dominating the House of Representatives. And this led to names like Czar Reed, who I know this looks like just a little old man, maybe frail. I mean, he's listening to early radio on headphones, presumably because he is now hard of hearing. It looks like a gentle grandfatherly figure, but he was one of those autocratic speakers of the House. We also have Uncle Joe Cannon. Again, in that same autocratic mold. Notice it's not a coincidence that both of those pictures are black and white, and both of those men are dressed in an old-fashioned way. Because there was a shift after what was referred to as the Revolt of 1910, revolt against powerful speakers of the House. This was followed by decades of diminished power for speakers of the House until they gained more agenda power after the 1970s. That's going to be kind of an important turning point for understanding how things have worked in Congress generally, but especially in the House. Something else that happened was an increase in especially the ideological homogeneity within each of the two parties. In the same time period, especially before the 1970s, it was much more common to have liberal Republicans from the northeastern United States and to have very conservative Democrats from the southern states. So, and you'll sometimes hear references to this, especially if you pay attention to policy, continue to pay attention to policy and politics in the United States after you leave this class. One of the huge changes that underlies a lot of stuff is that the parties have become much more ideologically homogenous within themselves. So Republicans have become more conservative as a group. Democrats have become consistently more thoroughly liberal as a group. You're going to find less crossover or less commonality in terms of ideology between Democrats and Republicans. And this is something that has enhanced the role of the speaker. Remember, the speaker is selected by a majority of the majority party. So if they are working with a more ideologically homogenous, I know I'm using the word homogenous a lot, but it is the best fit here, a more uniform party, then that is going to enhance their power to a point. We're going to see where we definitely get to perhaps an era of diminishing returns, or just kind of a shift in how that works. Had a little bit of an interruption there in the recording where I paused this, of course, talking about increased intra-party homogeneity in terms of ideology and how that was a factor of, at least for a while, enhanced power for the Speaker of the House. They were selected by a majority that was more uniform in what it wanted, and speakers were able to use that unity to their advantage to accomplish their policy objectives and the policy objectives of their party. Nancy Pelosi is an example of this. She became the first woman Speaker of the House after the referred as a wave election in 2006, 2 years prior to the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. And it's just to be clear, in case anybody's worrying, that is the gavel to keep order. She's not about to batter any children with a hammer. So just to be clear about that. But as the parties have become more uniform in their ideology, there's also been a tendency for more drift towards the extremes. And so while the power of the speaker is not formally declining, what is possible, especially so far as we've seen this within the Republican Party, is that new factions are forming. In a lot of ways, they may be less clear and certainly less stark than they were in the past, but out of this uniformity matched with a drift towards, farther to the political right, some Republican members of Congress, members of the House, are moving there seemingly faster than others, but because there are lots of them there, they can be very influential. The House Freedom Caucus that we met earlier can be a big part of this. And so it has been somewhat more difficult for a leader in the House to be selected as the Speaker. This is Mike Johnson, the Speaker as of 2025. And when he was selected, there were multiple votes that went without being able to pick a Speaker of the House. He had to make lots of promises to some of these very conservative members of Congress and factions, things like the Freedom Caucus, in order to secure his position. And so in some respects, he is now held hostage to those promises and at the mercy of these more conservative factions. So and I know if that all sounds very complicated and messy, it's because it is. It's difficult to kind of see the direction that this is going, and that's why there's a question mark behind declining again. But I do want you to be aware of that trend and where it may be going. And it's not clear how it would affect the Democrats, although towards the end of Nancy Pelosi's time, you could see the same things kind of happening to her, where new members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez come in, and as she is one of that self-described democratic socialist that we talked about earlier, and she challenged Nancy Pelosi as not sufficiently to the left, and therefore is not a representative or leader of the party as it was changing. And from here, we can go to something that is clearer, although perhaps less interesting to hear about, and that is committees. This is another place where I will refer you to your references packet for understanding how they fit within, especially how they fit within how a bill becomes a law. I will also remind you that each chamber, the House and the Senate, set their own agenda. So they may have different priorities, their leaderships may have different priorities, caucuses may have different priorities, and different legislation may be worked on in the two houses. All right. Every Congress, and by this I mean a 2-year period. We always talk about numbered Congresses, and it's based off of really the elections for the House of Representatives. That's why we cut it at the 2 years. Within every 2-year period, there are more than 10,000 bills that are proposed by members of the House and the Senate. And you do have to be a member of the House or the Senate to propose a bill. A lot of bills have heavy influence from personnel within the executive branch or interest groups, but they can only be proposed by members of the two chambers. So all of them are introduced by members. There are some things that you already know about from that quick references packet, especially. Committees screen bills. So of those 10,000 plus bills that are proposed, they are whittled down to a much, much, much smaller number by the screening work of committees. Those committees have subcommittees, which you have also seen, and they play an important role in the screening process. That's what we're going to look at next, as we talk about the functions of both types of committees. I put this within asterisks. This is very important. The committees and subcommittees have tremendous agenda power. Even if we're going to talk about the agenda power of the Speaker of the House, at this point still, and things do change, committees and subcommittees have a great deal of power over controlling the agenda, partly because they are the ones that guide bills. Bills get proposed. You've seen this from your quick reference packet. They are assigned to a committee based on the subject matter of that bill. From there, maybe kicked down within that committee to an even more specialized subcommittee. The committee and subcommittees also play a role, and this is something that you would not have seen in the reference packet, in oversight. And oversight is something we will also talk about in more detail later. Oversight refers to investigating and holding to account the executive branch. Most of the time, what we're talking about is investigating the executive branch to make sure that its actions are in line with laws that Congress has passed, money that has been appropriated for Congress for specific purposes. If parts of the executive branch are not enforcing the law as Congress passed it, or using resources as Congress has appropriated them, the oversight committees are meant to ferret that out and take action to realign those parts of the executive branch with what Congress intended. There are also multiple types of committees and subcommittees. This is why the previous slide said, wait, there's more. There are standing committees, and these are ones that we will often think about. I mean, if you think about a committee, this is the names of these will be what come to mind. They have specific policy areas, and their job, as we think about, they are very much about handling bills. The meat and potatoes of the legislative process are what they do. They're called standing committees. They have permanent status. There's no question about whether that committee will be around when the next Congress comes every 2 years. There are also joint committees. These, as you might have guessed, are made up of representatives and senators. For example, the Joint Economic Committee that's been around now for coming up on 80 years. These joint committees deal with a few key areas. So that there aren't a lot of them because, remember, most of the houses have their own agendas. They do their own things. But those key areas include the economy and taxation, where we need to have coordination between the two houses on a consistent basis to deal with those complex and important policy areas. Similar to joint committees, we also have conference committees, although these are going to be more temporary in nature. And of course, being like joint committees, they're made up of representatives and senators. The purpose of joint committees, and you can see this also in your process, your kind of visual of how a bill becomes a law, they are formed and convened to work out differences in legislation between the House and the Senate. So if the House passes a bill, it goes over to the Senate for consideration. The Senate makes some changes to that bill. Well, they have to pass the same bill before it can go to the president. So the conference committee is formed so that the representatives and senators can make compromises and work on a final bill that will be acceptable to a majority of members in both houses. There are also select committees. These can be permanent, but a lot of them are also temporary. For example, we have a select committee on the modernization of Congress. This is a committee that has specific purposes. There have been lots of these kinds of things over time, efforts to help Congress keep up with changes in technology, changes in the relationship with the executive branch, changes with the political climate in the United States. And like that committee, they tend to be very specific. We also need to talk about getting on a committee. One thing to know is, and this will make sense to you logically, representatives have fewer committee assignments than senators. There are fewer senators. There are 100 senators, 435 members of the House. Both chambers have to consider all of the same policy areas. So naturally, senators have to sit on more committees and deal with more policy areas than representatives. Representatives can be far more specialized. Getting on a committee is not a random process. Representatives and senators have certain desires in terms of their committee appointments. They want things that are personally important to them. If they are a veteran, they may want to be on the House Armed Services Committee. If they are a farmer, like Sam Graves, they may be very interested in getting on the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. Related to that, committee assignments may also be based on expertise. You may have physicians, and there are physicians within Congress that want to be on committees that deal with health issues or Medicaid, Medicare policy, for example. Also, certainly do not underestimate this. Representatives and senators want to be put on committees that will allow them to visibly help their constituents. The more they can point to how they have helped their constituents, the more likely they are to find themselves reelected. So they want relevant committee assignments. They also, some, especially if we're talking about long-term, long-serving members of the House and the Senate, they want to be able to get kind of the prestigious, influential committee assignments. get on the House Ways and Means Committee, for example. The assignments can be political. Big question that might be asked of a member asking for a certain committee appointment is, did you support the party leadership? If you did, it'll give you that committee that matches to what you want. However, if perhaps you have had a history recently of not voting in a way that your party likes, not backing legislation, they might not give you the committee assignment you want. They might even strip your committee assignment and put you somewhere else. They may put you, and specifically, they may try to move you to a committee where you are less able to help your constituents as a punishment. Let's just compare a couple of members of Congress and their committee assignments. Both of these will be from Missouri, both of these districts close to us here. Sam Graves, of course, is your member of Congress. He is the Republican representative from Missouri's 6th Congressional District, which is now about the northern third of the state. And he serves on the Armed Services Committee as a veteran. Specifically, within that, the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, as you can see, specialization increases as we go from the committee to the subcommittee level. Also, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. That's often, that is something that is going to be important to Northwest Missouri. We have a lot of rural areas, making sure that they receive federal funding to maintain transportation infrastructure and other forms of infrastructure is going to be very important to someone like Sam Graves. We also have Emanuel Cleaver, who is the Democratic representative from Missouri's 5th Congressional District. That is the area, Kansas City, Jackson County, that's the biggest area within his district, especially in terms of its population. He serves on the Committee on Financial Services, dealing with capital markets, but also housing and insurance. And I will be honest with you, I'm less familiar with Emanuel Cleaver because he represents a different district. As the representative of a very urbanized district, housing is going to be a concern. Also, being from a city with important economic ties, Kansas City has a Federal Reserve Bank, for example. Capital markets are something that I can also understand being something where it is going to be important to him, and perhaps also important to his constituents. What committees do. And I know we've already kind of touched on some of this stuff, but just to make sure we have the right focus. The standing committees, like I said, they are the ones that handle the meat and potatoes, bread and butter, nuts and bolts, however you want to think of it, of the legislative process. And when a bill comes in, the standing committee that receives that bill will assign it to the most relevant subcommittee. The subcommittees, this is the graveyard of bills. Most of them die here through a process we'll see again later called pigeonholing. And there will be a visual of that later. It refers to old-style desks that had lots of little nooks and crannies called pigeonholes, where they're very skinny and very deep, and it's easy to lose things in there and never find them again. That is what happens to a lot of bills. They get put in a pigeonhole, pushed to the back, nobody ever sees them again, they're dead. That's why you can have 10,000 plus bills every 2 years, with very few of them actually making it through the process to become law. You might be asking, why then do we have all these proposed bills? A lot of times members of the House and the Senate propose bills that are very specific for a very small interest. They're just doing it so basically they can say that they tried. Here was this thing that was important to some constituent group. I proposed your bill, or maybe they're proposing a bill just to make a statement. They know it's going to die, but they keep doing it anyway. Subcommittees will scrutinize the bill. If it makes it out of subcommittee, it goes back to the committee. So that's why I've got subcoms/coms here. When I say scrutinize, they will hold hearings from maybe people for and against that legislation, figure out who supports it, who's opposed to it, why. They will do research to find out perhaps what will be the economic or social impact of this legislation. They will also do what's called markup. Markup refers to modifying the bill. It is the most important product that comes out of committee. Once the bill is marked up, that means it's revised, put into a final form to be sent to the full chamber for floor debate and possibly a floor vote. If there is majority support in the committee, then that bill gets what's called a favorable report. And that is the point where it goes to the floor for debate and a vote. At that point, committee members help in the debate process. You have from the committees what are called floor managers. Their job, it's in a lot of ways, it's similar to what you've seen in your references packet about the whips, the people that are meant to kind of get members in line to support for a bill. Floor managers kind of have that same function. So remember, if it has majority support from the committee and it gets a favorable report, it means a majority of the committee members want that bill to be successful. And so that's why they do the job of getting support for the bill. They're also what's referred to as cue givers. So they will give advice to other members. One thing they might give cues as to just how strong the support from the committee is for that bill. And just kind of help members to understand. We do also need to single out, this gets triple asterisks on both sides, the House Rules Committee is very important. It is also very unique. It is something that only the House has, represented here, and you will typically see this for logos, Committee on Rules Republicans, Committee on Rules Democrats, because again, only the House has this. The House Rules Committee sets specific rules for each bill before debate. It schedules it for debate. This is when it is going to go to the floor so that members know when to come out to, especially to speak for or against a bill. Sets time limits for debate. Is this something we want to fast track and limit debate very strictly on? Is this something that needs to be talked about more? The Rules Committee decides those things. They also decide, will we allow any amendments or changes? For the same kind of bills that you would want to fast track with a short to debate time limit, you might also set rules to say this bill cannot be amended or changed. You can debate it, but then you have to vote it up or down without any changes to the bill. As we wrap up talking about committees, I do want to briefly focus on committee chairs. And these would be the chairman, chairwoman, chairperson, however you want to call it. For much of history, of course, it has been chairmen. They have been and are the top agenda setters within their committees. And I know we mention agenda setters a lot, but that is crucially important. The person who sets the agenda controls what things do get talked about, not talked about, what legislation makes it forward, what legislation doesn't. Agenda setting is a very important power. Once, committee chairs were more powerful, far more powerful than they are today. During this time period, we're talking about before the 1970s, to be a committee chair, you were selected based on two criteria. Were you a member of the majority party? Pay careful attention to that. I said member of the majority party. And were you the most senior person on that committee? If you belonged to the majority party and you had the most seniority, you were the committee chair. This is what's called the seniority system. Quite logically, if not creatively. These people could create their own subcommittees. So they could just speak them into existence. They could fill those subcommittees with only the members they wanted. They could pick the chair of those subcommittees. they could stop legislation that they personally opposed. This is where that agenda-setting power, even if it doesn't sound exciting, it is crucial. And to help understand why all of this matters so much. Before the 1970s, many of these committee chairs were Southern conservatives. This is where I said you only needed to be a member of the majority party. Well, I said it was so important that I said only a member of the majority party. That does not mean you had to be particularly loyal to your party as it currently existed and in line with what it currently wanted. James O. Eastland is maybe one of the most famous of these committee chairs who stopped legislation they personally opposed. Notice he was a Democrat. He was also from Mississippi. Those were the conservative Democrats. This was that area where there was less ideological uniformity within the parties. You had very liberal Democrats, you had very conservative Democrats. And people like him, just because they continued to run and win elections as Democrats and caucus with the Democrats, and because they were senior, they were able to keep their positions for as long as they could stay in office. And so they blocked a lot of legislation. Their power was diminished after 1970 through a loosening of the seniority system. Now, committee members are allowed to vote for who will chair that committee. And don't take this too far. In general, the seniority system is still what governs who becomes the chair of the committee. It's just now not so ironclad. There are also now term limits for chairs, not term limits for how long they can be in Congress. We don't have those, despite the fact that some people argue quite vociferously for them. I just mean here term limits in terms of how long you can be the chair of that committee and hold that position. Something else that has played in is what we've seen previously is the general increase in the power of the chamber leaders. How long that will continue is a question, but as things currently stand, that has diminished the power of the committee chairs. Before we end this lecture, we have something now completely different: staffers. Also not an exciting sounding group, and I will not convince probably the majority of you that these are people that we should be interested in, but they're too important to not talk about, simply because members of Congress cannot do all the work that they need to do within the current very complicated, fast-moving policy environment. And really, they haven't been able to for a very long time. After World War II, that's where a lot of the staff system we have today was created to help Congress keep up with things. A lot before this period, members of Congress, they did a lot more of the work themselves. Now there are staff. So members of Congress have their own personal staff. If you're a representative, the average number is around 17 members of personal staff. For senators, it's 41. Remember, senators represent entire states, so hence more need for staff. They also, remember, serve on more committees, so they need more staff to keep up with all those different policy areas. And what this works out to, for the people that count them up, I did not do this personally, there are 11,000 plus personal staff. Remember, those numbers above are just averages. A lot of the work they do is not specifically about helping members of Congress work on policy issues in Congress. Much of what the staffers do, is casework in the district. That is answering constituent phone calls, helping constituents with problems. Maybe it's a lost Social Security check. Might be helping someone who wants their child to get an appointment to the Army Academy West Point. It might be, in the past, it was clipping newspaper stories out of the newspaper to see how the member of Congress is being covered in the press, what issues there are being talked about, those kinds of things. Especially within those who work within the members of Congress offices, a lot of the work is done on policy research, legislative research. In addition to the personal staff of each member of Congress, there are committee staff. As you might have guessed, they work for the committees. There's a little over 2,000 of these, roughly, and they are enmeshed in all of the facets of what the committee does, except for the actual voting. They help monitor the executive. It's part of that oversight function. These committee staff tend to be very, very expert in their particular policy fields. And they are the people who will deal with a lot of the interface with interest groups who might be lobbying for certain changes in policy or proposing that Congress take up certain legislation, or that a member of Congress propose a bill about something. These committee staff really know their policy areas. Then there are the staff agencies. And the staff agencies, I will admit, and I told you I wouldn't be able to get most of you interested in these, but I do love the staff agencies. They are what I refer to as the lovable nerds. We have the Congressional Research Service, which here I'm just putting them as abbreviations. You should write out at least once, Congressional Research Service. You will always hear it talked about, especially if you're, say, listening to a podcast or something, you will hear them referred to as the CRS. They serve as the professional research teams for members of Congress. Members of Congress and their staff will ask them questions. The CRS processes about 250,000 specific requests for information every year. They provide information about legislation. They're also a source of information to us as citizens. They will, for example, provide summaries of a bill that a person who is not a lawyer or a legislator can understand. So they are also useful to you. And you also have to be kind of in that nerd club in order to be interested in what they're doing, but if you are, they provide you with important information. Then there's the Congressional Budget Office. And they do a lot of what you would think they would do based on the name of the staff agency. They study the economy, especially they look at the budget and how policy impacts are going to affect the budget and spending and the economy. Sorry, not budget and spending. Those would be the same thing. Budget and the economy. So they will look at something like a tariff policy, see how much money it is likely to generate for the budget in terms of revenue, but also how it might affect the economy. If the tariff brings in revenue directly through the tariff, but slows economic growth, that might negatively affect the broader economy. And if it reduces corporate profits, say, and companies fire workers who then have less income to pay taxes on, it could have kind of an offsetting effect on the budget. Those are all kinds of the tangled knots that the CBO deals with. Then there's the Government Accountability Office. Accountability is what it sounds like. They do what it sounds like. They are the watchdog. They're specifically focused on the executive branch, though they also play a role in oversight by Congress of the executive branch. And beyond that, they provide legal opinions to members of Congress in terms of how well a bill is likely to mesh or conflict with other laws that already exist. They also set accounting standards. I know you guys won't be excited. I did call them lovable nerds. They may be lovable, but they're still nerds. They set accounting standards. This is how do you get to count things like revenue, expenditures, and such. And this part is of less interest to us as we look at Congress. If there are claims made against the government for, say, damages of some sort, they are the ones who settle those claims against the government. If the government owes somebody money for something, they will be the people who resolve that. Maybe it's a contractor did some work for a federal agency and didn't get paid, or maybe they didn't think they were paid appropriately based on the agreement, the GAO can help settle those claims, or can settle those claims. And that is where we will stop here. And we will pick up with plenty more Congress ahead.